Hello, it's Scott Manley here. After the previous episode's successful lunar landing and return mission, we have a pile of science to spend. Now our next mission is going to be a manned landing on Minmus, which is the second smaller moon. So we're going to pick parts which will make manned landing a little easier and perhaps maximize the science return. So R&D lab. Now the first and most obvious thing is space exploration because it adds the air pressure gauge. Now we could push forward to the next stage of science and get the science lab. That's actually a useful thing. If you send a large science lab and load it up with science, you can get a lot more. Precision engineering is has some useful bits and bobs. Command modules has multi-crew command pods. Everything else is all like, they're all kind of meh. I mean, it looks like there's some good bits here, but nothing that will make the difference. Landing may be a good idea, as would advanced flight control. That adds the landing pod. But, you know, we don't need a specific landing pod because we're not going to do an Apollo-style mission. Miniaturization does give me the first docking node, so I think I might take that, largely because it will give me access to docking missions. Landing adds a bigger heat shield, which is completely useless if I don't have a bigger capsule. So yeah, let's go for miniaturization and advanced flight control. This also adds reaction control systems, which are very useful things to have in the long term. I mean, between the docking ports and the reaction control systems, we now have all the functionality we need for docking, even if we're not going to use it right away. So let's go to mission control and see if there's anything that we can do. We have explored Duna down there. That would be a nice one. I mean, Duna is an easy one to get to. We have the Delta V requirements. The downside is, yeah, we're going to have to wait a while, but there's no time limit on this. So we're going to get a bunch of money in advance. And it'll just take one of my contract slots. So hey, extra money, don't need to do anything until Duna is aligned. Now, let's go build a rocket. Now, I'm going to follow the booster model that I had in the previous episode. The Heartbleed mission, if you remember, used fuel crossfeed and a triple core common booster. Now, if you look in the top left, there's this advanced menu here, and this green rocket is something called sub-assemblies. Now we're going to take a copy of this by holding Alt and left clicking, and now we're going to drag it to this sub-assembly drop zone, and okay, it hasn't dropped it, but it says save sub-assembly. What we're doing is we are taking a copy of this whole subsection of the spacecraft. We're going to call that core launch, and now we are going to build our main spacecraft. Now it's going to be built around the Mark 1 pod, and we're going to stick this this probe on the front so it will provide SAS functionality, even if, say, the pilot is a scientist. The reason I'm going to use a scientist is because the scientist can reset experiments, and therefore I don't need to send multiple copies of some of the heavier ones. Anyway, we'll just build out this. This is our landing stage, a little bit of power and a heat shield. Below this, we of course have a decoupler, so we can decouple the actual landing stage. A little service bay here that we can put our experiments in, and a Science Junior. Now, since this is your first manned mission, I want to make it as easy as possible, so I'm going to build a very wide lander here, and the way I'm going to do this is put on 3 tanks in triple symmetry here. We're going to attach the landing gear to this, but these will be our fuel and everything. So we need to add aerodynamics to this. And with these, you actually need to add aerodynamics on the back, because that will actually improve their drag model a little. Now, we put the engine on the middle, but the fuel won't transfer without fuel pipes. So you need 3 fuel pipes all feeding directly into that engine. See that? So we'll draw from each of those tanks. Now, finally, we need to put some more science instruments in here. We need to max out all the science we can get, but since we're sending a scientist, we only need 1 of these things. Best way to get 1 exactly in the middle is to put it in double symmetry mode and try to line it up so that they're in essentially the same place. You see me mucking around with this. My mouse is never quite as precise as I would like. Flip it around and then press Shift X to remove symmetry. Put the other science instruments on. It doesn't matter so much with them because they have because they're massless essentially. Although the mass is transferred to the parent object, the mass will be transferred at the center of mass so you don't have to worry about symmetry when you're placing certain types of massless parts. Okay, so landing gear goes on the outside. We could have got that better landing gear, I guess, but that actually takes more mass than we need. Yeah, yes, so we're just gonna check. We've got these extended below the thing. And now we go to sub-assemblies and just drag this. Wow, bingo, look, we've saved all that time by using a sub-assembly, and we have a rocket. Okay, there's a few other bits and pieces we need to attend to prior to launch. First of all, we need to come up with a name, so we're going to call this Blackwatch, another NSA security tool. We're going to swap out the crew. We want to put Bob Kerman in. He is a scientist and he will be saving us mass by resetting experiments. And then of course there's the launch clamps, which I totally did not forget and edit out because my spacecraft had stuck to the launch pad. Okay, so here it is on the launch pad. And once again, I need to make a last-minute staging correction here. Okay, bring up the resource tab, throttle 100%, go to map, and we are looking for Minmus. Now, I'm purposely picking Minmus. Let me make it clear, this spacecraft is actually not capable of landing on the moon. I'm going to Minmus first because it's different, and this is a tutorial series. Minmus is on an inclined orbit. And we want to launch onto an inclined orbit to minimize our changes. Now, if you look at the nav ball, north is actually downwards. So we actually want to launch along that kind of angle there. So we just want to give a few degrees. We're going to go up straight initially. Now, if you're having trouble with launching this, if you find that you can't get to orbit or something, it's perfectly valid to add some more solid rocket boosters to the outside of this just to help it get off the pad and move a little faster. But, you know, that's completely unnecessary. It has plenty of delta V. Now, if you're planning on taking this design to the moon, then you definitely want those external solid rocket boosters. They don't add a huge amount of delta V to the bottom line, but what they do add is thrust to weight ratio early on, and there's a big difference between moving, accelerating upwards slowly like this versus accelerating up to 100 meters per second very, very quickly. It actually saves you a lot of time in terms of gravity losses. Gravity losses are where you're accelerating upwards at, say, 1.5 G, but gravity is pulling you down at 1 G, so the net effect is that you're only accelerating at half a G, which means you're losing essentially, 66% of your fuel early on, just simply because you're not accelerating fast enough against gravity. Anyway, we're performing a standard gravity turn here. Be aware, do not turn this thing too flat, because once we jettison those boosters, that second stage doesn't have enough thrust to accelerate upwards as fast as we would like. So if you find yourself flattening out or shallowing out too early, then you could be in trouble, and it's okay to go back and reload or go back and add solid rocket boosters. Anyway, look, we've hit 41 seconds here. We're waiting for burnout, and bingo, ditch those. And now look, our acceleration is just below 1 G here. Now, even although our acceleration is less than the force of gravity, because we're applying thrust sideways, we're picking up lateral velocity. This is quite common in rockets, that after jettisoning a stage, the acceleration from the engines is now below the force of gravity. But because we've already lofted it on this ballistic arc, we're quite able to get it into orbit. Now, what I'm doing here is examining the descending node. Because we have targeted Minmus, you're going to get these little orbital indicators. And we want to minimize this by adjusting our orbit up and down here. You see our descending node is minus 1.2. So I'm actually pushing my orbit just south a little to try and keep that, try to minimize this, or try to reduce that. You want to make your orbital inclination changes while you're doing the launch. You don't want to have to make orbital inclination changes later on because they're less efficient. I'm also paying attention to my periaps and making sure that the time to periaps isn't starting to drop off too quickly. If that happens, of course, that's a sign that you're perhaps beginning to fall back due to lack of thrust or lack of velocity. We're above 1 kilometer per second easily. And yeah, I think we're doing good here. 43 seconds. If that was in the 30-second time range, I would be very concerned about getting into space efficiently. It'd be possible, but you might spend more time in the atmosphere than you would really need. Okay, yeah, we're picking up. We're at 1400 meters per second now. As you get faster and faster, the curvature of the orbit begins to essentially reduce the force of gravity that's perceived. It's a little more complicated than that, but essentially around about 1600 meters per second, the force of gravity pulling you down is about 1/2. So we're starting to get into this situation now where we're essentially free to just accelerate sideways as quickly as possible. Yeah, look, our time to orbit, our time to periapse, our apoapse, time to apoapse is now just rising as quickly as our engines will push us there. Moving it over 2 kilometers per second. Descending node has decreased even further. I'm just pushing this north, right, to make sure our descending node is high enough. And I think we're getting close to burning out our engines here, so I'm just going to let it. Bingo! 270 fuel left. Blackwatch has burned out all of its fuel. This was a really nicely timed launch, actually. I'm surprised at this. I'm surprised at how good this was. Again, I did this with Kerbal Engineer just to check that it had enough delta V, but I didn't know where it would burn out its fuel. Yes, on paper this upper stage has about 2200 meters per second of delta V. So that's enough to get to Minmus and land. It is not enough to go to the moon and land. If you want to get it to the moon, it has to have another stage attached right now in orbit to perform the transfer and lunar orbital insertion. Okay, so we're just gonna... I guess that we can set a maneuver node right here to get ourselves into orbit. It's always good to go into a parking orbit if you're not sure. If you know what you're doing, you can absolutely go straight from a launch into a transfer orbit to the moon or Minmus. But since you're all beginners, it's better to go into a parking orbit and make sure everything's working. Obviously, NASA was not beginners. They just went into a parking orbit just so they could do systems checks and make sure everything had survived launch into space. You're sitting on top of a rocket is not necessarily kind to the delicate systems and hardware which is used to put men on the moon. Okay, so we've time accelerated around, we got about 50 meters per second burn that we need to do. You can see the rest of the spacecraft has moved 4.5 kilometers away, simply from that little bump the decoupler gave them. And that distance will only grow further now that we're boosting ourselves into orbit. Instead, that other object is being left behind to fall back to Kerbal. Yeah, we could have tried putting parachutes on that if we wanted. Okay, so now we need to transfer to Minmus. And the same rule applies as to the moon. You want to look at the orbit from above, put Minmus on the left or the right, and then create a maneuver node essentially at 90 degrees away from it. So I'm going to drag this out. Now, because I have already done my inclination correction, this thing should land pretty close to the orbit. There, okay, so we've landed pretty close to the orbit. What I think I'm going to do is just adjust the position of the time of the burn. So to adjust the time of the burn, you pick that node up and drag it along the orbit. There, you see that? Making it earlier. Oh, and there we go. Brilliant. Oh, so we've totally got an encounter. Now, if you're going to Minmus, because the plane isn't guaranteed to be aligned particularly well, and because the sphere of influence of Minmus is quite small, you may miss it. But the main thing is to get the orbits as close as possible, and then you can perhaps perform correction burns once you're out there. Okay, so we've got our solar panels aligned, get our maneuver nodes aligned, and it's time to time accelerate towards the next maneuver node. So you just click on any orbit and warp to next maneuver, and in theory it should take you on a quick scenic tour around the planet Kerbal below you. Viewing the planet Earth from orbit has had a profound effect on many astronauts, and I suspect it will have a similar effect on the Kerbals. I'm sure Bob can't help but be profoundly moved by the realization that his entire race exists in a very thin film of atmosphere on this very, very small planet in a very, very big universe. Okay, so we've hit our location, we've time accelerated around. We're going to start firing our engines at 45 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, mark! Yeah, there we go. Okay, so throttle at 100%, and then we're going to do most of this burn from the map screen here, because we need to be able to see when we reach it. You can see the other satellite that I launched previously into polar orbit is still there. Now, while I'm waiting for this to happen, I will point out that many of you may not have performed a decent alignment of the orbits to start with, and that's entirely valid. But in that case, if you can get out close to Minmus, but you can't get an encounter, don't muck around with your inclination in low Kerbal orbit. Instead, add an extra maneuver node partway through after you've made your insertion burn. Do it about halfway between Kerbal and Minmus. This is only if you haven't got an encounter which passes through Minmus's sphere of influence, right? You'll know when it's passing through the sphere of influence because the orbits change color to show that it's following a different central body. See, in this case, we've got it just fine, but many of you may have to make corrections, and best place to make corrections is about halfway there. I have plenty of other videos where I have demonstrated this, but in this case we got it on target first time. Oh, we also had a moon encounter. That's another thing you might run into. Literally, you might run into the moon, and if you find that your desired launch orbit is going to be affected by the moon, wait a couple of orbits until the moon is no longer in its place. Okay, and there! Bingo, we touched it. Leave that, and so we're ready to go. And again, it's highly likely that your particular orbit doesn't match mine. That's okay, just as long as you get this color change here to show that you've actually entered the sphere of influence of Minmus. I can't cover every single eventuality because, you know, orbiting is chaotic. When you have multiple encounters, you're sensitive dependence to initial conditions and things like that. Okay, so we're going to fly out into deep space, further than any Kerbal has gone before. And yeah, I think this is a good place for us to leave this. We'll come back in a second part. Until then, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.